Welcome to the Deep Dive, and this is a special edition of Congress in Context. The past week up on Capitol Hill, well, it was really defined by these manufactured crises, some legislative breakdowns, and, a few last-minute saves. We were all watching this political time bomb just ticking down. But what our source material shows is that the real stakes, they weren't just about some funding deadline. They were actually about your health care, our national security, and global economic competition.
That's absolutely right. I mean, the immediate drama, the noise around a potential government shutdown, that got all the headlines. But underneath that, Congress was really wrestling with some crucial deep policy divides on everything from high-tech defense research all the way to China's push for mineral monopolies.
So our mission today is to cut through all that noise, unpack this stack of sources we have, and really understand the immediate stakes. And maybe more importantly, the deeper policy implications for you listening right now. Here's kind of the core tension we found. These procedural deadlines Congress sets for itself, they're now running head-on into personal deadlines, the kind that affect millions of American families. Let's start right there with that immediate crisis.
Okay, so we were staring directly at that September 30th midnight shutdown cliff. It was getting close. And to prevent that, the House did pass a short-term spending bill. It's called a continuing resolution, or CR. The designation was H.R. 5371. And this bill, it was meant to fund the government temporarily.
Right, just a stopgap. Until when? November 21st?
November 21st, 2025. That was the idea. But the Senate ultimately killed it.
Killed it? How?
Well, it failed to pass. Even after they tried a motion to reconsider, the final roll call vote, it was 55 yeas to 45 nays.
So it needed 60 votes. Fell 5 short.
Exactly. That 60-vote threshold is key in the Senate. And the arguments around why it failed, interestingly, weren't primarily about spending levels. They were really about the legislative process itself.
The process. Okay, tell us about that. What were the sides?
Well, Republicans, you had figures like Thune, Barrasso, Britt, Cotton. They framed H.R. 5371 as, quote, clean, nonpartisan, just a basic stopgap. They accused Democrats of driving a Schumer shutdown by holding the bill hostage, demanding specific policy items. They called it ransom.
Ransom, strong word. They even brought up past comments.
They did. They pulled out a 2013 quote from Senator Schumer himself, where he apparently called a government shutdown idiocy.
Okay, so that's one side. But legislators always call their own bills clean. What were the actual demands that Democrats were making? What was this so-called ransom?
Right, good question. The Democratic demands, according to the sources, were basically twofold. First, they wanted an extension of the Affordable Care Act premium tax credits. That's a big one. And second, they wanted to end Republican efforts to use these tools called rescissions and impoundments.
Okay, hold on. Rescissions and impoundments. Can you clarify that for us? What exactly are those in this context?
Sure. They're basically tools that one branch, often the president or the executive branch, can use to cancel or just withhold spending that Congress has already approved, authorized. So in this case, Republicans were apparently using them to try and undo some previously approved funding. Democrats argue, look, this undermines Congress's power of the purse, and it needs to stop.
So it's a power struggle over spending authority layered onto the funding fight. Makes sense. And what was the Democrats' counter-argument about the CR itself? They didn't see it as clean.
Not at all. They called it extremely partisan. You had leaders like Schumer, Murray, Cantwell, Schatz arguing that, unlike, they said, 13 previous CRs, this one involved no discussion, zero negotiation between party leaders. Their point was, major spending bills just can't pass the Senate without some genuine bipartisan buy-in.
Okay, so process arguments, power struggles. Yeah. But you mentioned the ACA credits. That sounds like the real crux here.
I think it is. And here's the deep insight, the reason this matters so much to you, the listener. It's that healthcare crisis connection. The fight over those ACA premium tax credits is why Democrats were insisting they couldn't just wait until that November 21st CR date.
So we're seeing a direct clash then. Congressional procedure versus real-world deadlines for people.
Exactly. Right now, tens of millions of Americans are getting letters telling them about potentially massive health insurance rate increases. Our sources cite averages around 114% if those ACA credits expire. And here's the critical timing. Those notices started going out October 1st.
October 1st,
Yeah.
before the proposed CR even ended.
Way before. And open enrollment, when people actually have to pick their plans, that starts in some states, like Idaho was mentioned, as early as October 15th. So people have to make these huge decisions about their health coverage, their budgets, long before November 21st.
And those predicted rate hikes, they're not small numbers either. You mentioned some states.
Yeah, the debate cited specific projections, like Arizona, possibly 48% increases. Georgia 39%, Texas just over 39%, North Carolina almost 30%, Washington state 21%. And Democrats didn't just blame the expiring credits, they linked this crisis to other Republican policy moves too. Things like Medicaid cuts, which apparently stripped coverage from about 11 million Americans, and also attempts to take away $50 billion meant for rural hospitals. They called that fund the Rural Healthcare Hospital Lifeline.
Wow, so the stakes were incredibly high. And what about the immediate consequences if the government had shut down or if this delay continues?
Well, Senators Durbin, Whitehouse, Blumenthal were very clear about that. They listed specific, tangible harms. Disruptions to veterans' care, for one. A pause in hiring and training much-needed air traffic controllers. And crucially, non-payment for federal law enforcement and other public safety programs. Things people rely on every day.
Okay, so that healthcare deadline wasn't the only clock running out with big consequences. We saw a similar dynamic, maybe a failure, around essential R&D funding too. Let's shift gears a bit, from that financial cliff to a battle over innovation policy. Specifically, these programs called the Small Business Innovation Research and Small Business Technology Transfer Programs, SBIR and STTR.
Yes, SBIR and STTR. These are really crucial programs. Together, they set aside something like $5 billion every year. It acts as vital seed money for American small businesses, for startups, the ones developing cutting-edge tech, often for defense or other federal agencies. It's a key way we keep our technological edge sharp.
And the House seemed to agree on its importance.
Totally. The House unanimously passed H.R. 5100. That was a clean, simple, one-year extension of these programs.
Unanimous in the House. But it died in the Senate. Why? You mentioned a procedural mechanism.
That's right. It died because of something called unanimous consent, or UC.
Unanimous consent. Explain that. How can one move stop something the entire House agreed on?
Well, UC is essentially a shortcut in the Senate. When a senator asks for UC on a bill, they're basically asking, can we just pass this right now? No debate, no formal vote. But it only takes one single senator to object, to say, I object, and the whole thing stops dead.
One senator. Wow. So who asked for UC and who objected?
Senator Markey asked for UC for that clean one-year extension bill, H.R. 5100. He argued it was essential, especially to keep existing safeguards against foreign risk in place for these tech programs. But Senator Ernst objected. She said, no, we need immediate reforms before we extend it.
Okay, reforms. What were her specific objections? What problems did she see?
She focused on two main issues based on the source material. First, waste. She talked about SBR mills, basically, larger companies that she argued were just draining funds meant for small innovators. She cited one company getting $650 million over time, which she said was more than the total SBR's TTR funding given to companies in 26 states combined.
$650 million to one company.
Okay.
And the second issue?
Foreign risk. Specifically, Chinese espionage concerns. She stated that between 2023 and 2024, something like 835 applications were flagged for potential foreign risk. But, she claimed, only 303 of those were actually denied funding, and that some agencies were denying less than 1% of the applications flagged for this kind of risk.
So she wanted reforms tied to the extension. What did she propose?
She proposed a very short 30-day extension instead of a year, but tied to it two immediate reforms. First, lifetime funding limits for companies participating. She argued this would only affect a tiny fraction, like 0.2%, but would stop the alleged mills. And second, standardizing the definition of foreign risk across all agencies using the program.
So what's the policy trade-off there? Why couldn't they agree?
Well, you see the clear ideological stakes, right? Senator Ernst sees those lifetime limits as crucial for stopping fraud, ensuring funds really go to small businesses. But Senator Markey and others likely argue, wait, those limits could punish the most successful startups, the ones that actually scale and maybe take the big risks needed for truly disruptive defense tech. And because they couldn't bridge that gap, the entire program lapsed. Funding stopped.
Another instance of deadlock. And we saw something similar with cybersecurity.
Yeah, very similar dynamic. Senator Peters tried to use UC to pass S. 1377. That was described as a clean, bipartisan 10-year extension of some important cyber protections. He even noted it had support from the previous Trump administration and industry relies on it. But again, an objection came. This time, the reasons cited were concerns about free speech implications and a perceived lack of compromise in the bill. So, stalled again.
It's quite a pattern. Before we move on, though, you found something interesting in the House committee reports.
Oh, yeah. Amidst all this high-stakes drama, potential shutdowns, lapses in critical defense R&D, we reviewed the House committee reports. And guess what? The House Committee on Homeland Security found time to report out a bill, H.R. 3965. Its purpose: to create a pilot program for U.S. Customs and Border Protection, to adopt dogs from local animal shelters, to train them as support dogs for personnel.
Support dogs for CBP. Perhaps a moment of legislative balance, as you say. All right, let's turn our attention now from these domestic policy specifics to global strategy. You mentioned Senator Cornyn raising alarms about what he called economic warfare.
Yes, Senator Cornyn delivered a speech focusing on a really significant global issue: China's growing dominance, almost a monopoly, in critical minerals and rare earth elements. This is arguably one of the most significant long-term geopolitical threats we saw highlighted in the sources this week.
And just to be clear, these aren't just obscure materials, right? These minerals are fundamental to modern life and defense.
Absolutely. They are the absolute backbone of modern technology. We're talking essential components for aerospace, advanced U.S. defense systems, think missiles, fighter jets, but also everyday things: your iPhone, electric vehicles, wind turbines.
So what was Cornyn's argument about China's strategy? How are they achieving this near monopoly?
He framed it very starkly. China is treating the global market as a zero-sum game. They aren't just competing, they're aiming for total control. He detailed specific methods of what he termed economic warfare. This includes things like investing huge sums, like $57 billion mentioned, through state-backed loans, particularly in countries participating in their Belt and Road Initiative, to lock up mineral supplies. Also, banning the export of the technologies needed to process these minerals, keeping that know-how in China, and, maybe most effectively, deliberately flooding the global market with cheap minerals to drive out competitors.
Okay, wait. Flooding the market, driving prices down. He cited some big drops, right? Cobalt, nickel, lithium, all the way down since 2023. How does making them cheaper help China long term? And isn't that just good for consumers, lower prices?
That's the crucial strategic point Cornyn was making. China isn't playing for short-term profits here. They're playing the long game for market dominance. By artificially pushing prices down so low, they make it impossible for mines and processing facilities in the U.S. and allied countries to compete financially. He pointed out that this strategy led directly to the closure of competitors, including the only cobalt mine operating in the United States. It closed less than a year after it opened because it just couldn't compete with the artificially low prices. So short term, maybe prices look good. Long term, China ends up controlling almost the entire supply chain. He cited a figure of 90% of the processing now happening in China.
90%. That's staggering control. This really highlights the urgency, then, of securing our own supply chains. There was a reference to President Trump's executive order from March 2025 about this.
Yes, exactly. Cornyn mentioned that order, which directed federal agencies to work together, try to accelerate domestic investment, domestic production of these critical minerals. It shows this is a bipartisan concern spanning administrations.
Okay. And speaking of presidential actions and administration roles, we also need to talk about a very controversial nomination that came up.
Bill White, nominated for U.S. ambassador to Belgium, which is a really sensitive post, right? Because Belgium hosts NATO headquarters.
Right. And Senator Kaine raised some very strong objections, not just policy disagreements, but about White's fundamental fitness for diplomacy. What was the pattern of behavior he cited?
Kaine laid out several instances suggesting, in his view, a serious lack of judgment. He mentioned White had previously called a Senate colleague, Senator Lindsey Graham, a snake, that he had repeated conspiracy theories about the 2020 election, and, perhaps most pointedly, that White had publicly called for the Republican governor of Georgia, Brian Kemp, and the Republican Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger, to be prosecuted and locked up.
Wow. Calling for the prosecution of elected officials from his own party. Kaine's argument is essentially that this shows a lack of temperament needed for a diplomat, especially at NATO.
Precisely. That was the core argument about judgment and temperament. But then there was another incident Kaine highlighted, one involving Belgium directly, which made it even more alarming from his perspective.
What happened there?
Kaine pointed out that Bill White had retweeted a video. The video was from a figure in Belgium named Dries van Langenhove. Van Langenhove was described in the Senate record as a convicted, Holocaust-denying, pro-violence anti-Semite. And White retweeted this video shortly before Van Langenhove was actually sentenced in Belgium for inciting violence and denying the Holocaust. Senator Kaine argued this specific action, retweeting that figure at that moment, was a direct insult to a key U.S. ally, Belgium, which he said is working hard to combat anti-Semitism. It raised profound questions for Kaine about White's suitability for that specific ambassadorial post.
So if we pull back and look at all these source documents this whole week, we're seeing a clear pattern emerge, aren't we? It seems like every time Congress tries to pass something relatively straightforward, maybe even non-controversial, like funding the government, extending these vital R&D programs, somebody, somewhere, uses the procedural rules to attach some high-stakes political bomb. And the result? Gridlock.
That definitely seems to be a recurring theme. And looking ahead, the immediate focus, well, it's certainly going to snap right back to that funding battle. It's still completely tangled up with those ACA tax credits and the very real possibility that higher insurance rates could lock in for people soon. Plus, the fate of other major legislation like the National Defense Authorization Act, S. 2296, that's still pending. And these contested nominations, like Bill White's, they remain unresolved too.
And this deep dive, I hope it shows you, listening, exactly how this policy and this process, which can seem abstract, instantly becomes highly personal. I mean, if you are on an ACA plan, this legislative delay we talked about, it could mean your premium increase for next year is already locked in, simply because of that October 1st notification deadline hitting before Congress acted.
Yeah, and it also shows that even these policy items that seem kind of buried in legislative jargon, like the SBR CTR extensions or the critical minerals strategy, they have truly profound national security and economic impacts, impacts that actually shape global stability, our tech edge, our supply chains. And if you want accountability or just want to understand more, the details of these bills are public. You can track the substance of these arguments we discussed today yourself on congress.gov. You know, the fact that these procedural tactics, like objections to UC or holding up CRs, are being used to force decisions on massive issues like healthcare costs and defense spending really shows the immense power your representatives wield, even in what looks like just technical back and forth on the Senate floor.
Okay, so we saw a lot of political gamesmanship around a funding deadline, a deadline Congress set for itself. But what seems really fascinating here, maybe troubling, is that the deadlines that truly affect American families, like that October 15 health insurance enrollment deadline,
Yeah.
those deadlines are now seemingly being weaponized in these negotiations. And that raises a really important question for all of us, I think. When these procedural deadlines clash head-on with the personal deadlines that dictate your costs, your access to care, where does Congress's ultimate responsibility lie?
That's a profound point to consider, especially as these kinds of debates are likely to continue unfolding.
Well, thank you for joining us for this deep dive into Congress in context. We really encourage you to explore the bills we discussed, look them up, and definitely reach out to your own representatives. Let them know what you think. We'll see you next time.